The Pacific Ocean in 1942 was not an ocean. It was a void. It was a universe of blackness, so absolute and suffocating that the line between the sky and the sea ceased to exist. To the men who sailed upon it, the night was a living entity, a predator that stalked them from dusk until dawn. In this vast theater of war, the greatest empires on earth were grappling for control, and they had come to realize that the one who could conquer the night would conquer the ocean. The battle for the Pacific was not just a battle of steel and explosives, it was a battle of philosophies, a duel between two different ways of seeing the world. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force that had elevated the human senses to an art form, a brotherhood of warriors who trained to become one with the darkness. On the other, the United States Navy, a sleeping giant awakened, a nation of engineers and inventors who believed that the darkness itself could be defeated, not with the human eye, but with the human mind. This war would be decided by who could see in the dark, and the key, a strange metallic box of wires and tubes, had just fallen into the wrong hands. The Imperial Japanese Navy was, by 1942, arguably the most proficient and dangerous naval force on the planet. Its victories had been stunning, a wave of conquest that had shattered the old colonial empires. But this proficiency was born from a place of perceived weakness. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty had been a deep, festering wound to Japanese pride. It had limited their fleet, locking them into a 5-5-3 ratio with Great Britain and the United States. They would never be able to match the American industrial machine, ship for ship. The admirals in Tokyo knew this. So they did what any brilliant cornered strategist would do. They changed the rules of the game. They would not fight the American fleet in a sunlit, long-range gunnery duel. They would drag them into the dark. They created a doctrine of the Kessen, the single decisive battle. And this battle, they decreed, would be fought at night. The entire Navy, from its shipbuilding to its training, was optimized for this one purpose. They trained their lookouts with a fanaticism that bordered on the mystical. Men were selected for their genetic predisposition for superior night vision. They spent thousands of hours in pitch-black rooms, learning to identify the faintest variations in shadow. They were fed vitamins, their eyes massaged, their lives dedicated to one task, seeing the unseeable. They were equipped with the largest, most powerful naval binoculars ever created, optical behemoths that could gather starlight and resolve the silhouette of a destroyer at distances the Allies considered impossible. And they had a weapon to match this doctrine. A weapon so secret and so effective it was practically a silver bullet, the Type 93 torpedo. The Allies would come to call it the Long Lance, and they would learn to speak its name with a mixture of terror and awe. While American torpedoes were unreliable, slow, and left a massive trail of compressed air bubbles, the Long Lance was a work of art. It was a 24-inch monster carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. But its true genius was its propulsion. It was fueled by pure liquid oxygen. This was an incredibly volatile and dangerous choice. One spark could vaporize a ship, but it gave the torpedo two devastating advantages. First, it had a staggering range, over 20 miles, 3 times that of its American counterpart. Second, its exhaust was carbon dioxide, which dissolved in the water. It left no wake. It was a silent, invisible, long-range killer. A Long Lance fired in the dark by a ship that had spotted you from 10 miles away meant you were simply gone. Your ship would explode, and you would never even know who had fired. This was the Japanese way of war. Human skill, perfected and honed, combined with one perfect lethal weapon. On the other side of the ocean, the Americans were chasing a different kind of magic. While the Japanese had perfected the human eye, the Americans were building a new eye. Born from the desperation of the British in the Battle of Britain, the technology of radio detection and ranging, or radar, had crossed the Atlantic. In secret laboratories like the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the brightest minds in the country were gathered in a single, top-secret crusade. They weren't just building a tool. They were weaponizing the electromagnetic spectrum. They were building a box that could send a pulse of radio energy into the void and listen for its echo. On a flickering green cathode ray screen, a trained operator could see a blip of light, a ghost, a phantom, that represented a very real ship or a very real airplane miles away through the thickest fog, the driving rain, or the blackest night. It was sorcery, but in 1S942, the sorcerers were still apprentices. The technology was new, it was buggy, and many of the old-school battleship admirals didn't trust it. They were men who had built their careers on the seaman's eye, on intuition and the feel of the wind. This new radar, as it was becoming known, was a temperamental, delicate machine. The early sets were enormous, heavy contraptions with strange, bed-spring-like antennas, and the men who operated them were still learning. In the chaotic, desperate spring of 1942, this clash of philosophies became a collision of hardware. As the American and British forces in the Philippines and Singapore were overwhelmed by the Japanese tidal wave, they were given orders to destroy their secret equipment. But in the panic of retreat, priorities were muddled. Codes and documents were burned first. The heavy, bulky, and seemingly indestructible electronics were often left behind. In the smoking ruins of Corregidor and in the captured British air defense stations in Singapore, Japanese technical intelligence teams, led by brilliant minds like Dr. Yoji Ito of the Naval Technical Research Institute, began to sift through the wreckage. It was a treasure trove. They found the American SCR-270 and 271, the large long-range air warning radars. These were the exact same models that had been at the Opana radar site on Oahu and had in fact detected the Japanese attack force approaching Pearl Harbor, a warning that had been tragically dismissed. They also found the SCR-268, a more complex multi-antenna set designed not for searching, but for aiming anti-aircraft guns at a single, chosen target. The equipment was crated up and shipped back to Japan for meticulous reverse engineering. Dr. Ito and his teams were impressed. The quality of the American components, the sheer industrial power it represented, was sobering. But as they analyzed its function, they came to a series of conclusions. And these conclusions, based on the evidence they had, would prove to be catastrophically wrong. First, they looked at the SCR-270. They identified it correctly as a long-range air warning set. It was designed to spot bombers. Second, they looked at the SCR-268. They identified it correctly as an anti-aircraft gun-laying radar. It was designed to track planes. They tested the equipment and found that when it was aimed low towards the ocean, the screen would be overwhelmed by clutter, a blizzard of false signals bouncing off waves and nearby land. The Japanese looked at this evidence, and their own cultural bias filled in the blanks. Ah, they concluded, this is what we thought. This technology is for airplanes. It is defensive. They saw no evidence of a compact ship-mounted surface search radar. The idea that this technology could be used offensively to hunt ships in the dark was a leap they did not make. Why would they? Their own human lookouts were far superior. Their eyes were not confused by sea clutter. Their doctrine was already perfect. The captured radar, they decided, was an interesting curiosity, but it did not change the fundamental equation of the night battle. It confirmed in their minds that the Americans were clumsy, over-reliant on fragile machines, and had no answer to the skill and spirit of the Japanese warrior. This single fatal misunderstanding would shape the next year of the war. The Japanese, having looked at the enemy's best magic, dismissed it. They believed they were still the masters of the dark. This belief would be put to the ultimate test in a narrow, treacherous body of water in the Solomon Islands, a place that would soon earn the most grim nickname of the war, Iron Bottom Sound. In August 1942, the United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first American offensive of the war, a desperate gamble to seize an airfield and stop the Japanese advance. The campaign immediately became a brutal, grinding battle of attrition. By day, American aircraft from the newly christened Henderson Field controlled the skies. But the moment the sun touched the horizon, the balance of power shifted. The night belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Almost every evening, like clockwork, a flotilla of Japanese cruisers and destroyers, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the weary Marines, would storm down the slot, the channel between the islands. They would blast the Marine perimeter with their 8-inch guns, drop off fresh troops, and be gone by dawn. The U.S. Navy, tasked with protecting the transports that were the Marines' lifeline, had to stop them. On the night of August 8, 1942, an Allied task force was set to do just that. It was a hodgepodge of ships, the American heavy cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, USS Astoria, and USS Chicago, along with the Australian heavy cruiser HMS Canberra. They were divided into two groups, guarding the two entrances to the Sound, circling the ominous dark cone of Savo Island. On paper, they were a powerful force, and, crucially, they had the magic box. Several of the ships, including the Chicago, were equipped with the brand-new state-of-the-art SG surface search radar. This wasn't the clumsy SCR-270. This was a compact centimetric wave radar specifically designed to pick up ships. It could, in theory, see a destroyer at 20 miles. The Allies were a wall of electronic sentinels, but a weapon is only as good as the man who wields it. The Allied crews were exhausted. They had been at their stations for over 2 days, under constant threat of air attack in the suffocating tropical heat. Their command was divided, a mix of Australian and American officers with different procedures. The overall commander, Admiral Victor Crutchley, had just been called away to a meeting, leaving the force leaderless. Worse, the captains of these ships did not trust their radar. It was new, it was temperamental, it showed ghosts. They still trusted the human eye. They were, in a word, unprepared. Into this unpreparedness steamed Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, his striking force, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. He had no radar. He didn't need it. He had his lookouts, his long-lance torpedoes, and his iron-willed adherence to the doctrine of the night battle. His plan was audacious: sail directly into the middle of the Allied formation, annihilate them, and escape. As Mikawa's flagship, the Chokai, approached Savo Island, he launched float planes. They droned over the Allied fleet, dropping flares, and their pilots coolly reported the exact disposition of the enemy ships. The Allied captains, seeing the flares, assumed they were from friendly planes. The first failure. Then, the American radar did work. The destroyer USS Patterson, on picket duty, got a clear contact. "Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering the harbor," its operators screamed into the radio. On the destroyer USS Ralph Talbot, another operator saw the screen light up with blips. But what happened next was a catastrophic failure of doctrine. The information was slow to be relayed. It was garbled. On the bridges of the cruisers, the reports were met with skepticism. "Are you sure? Must be land clutter. It's probably just a friendly destroyer." Before the Americans could believe their own magic, the Japanese masters of the dark struck. A lookout on the Chokai, a human being, peering through a pair of giant binoculars, spotted the silhouette of the Canberra against the slightly lighter sky. The range was over 12,000 yards. Mikawa gave the simple chilling order, "Commence firing!" The night exploded. A wave of silent, wakeless long-lance torpedoes hissed from the Japanese cruisers. Seconds later, their 8-inch guns roared. The HMAS Canberra was hit by 2 torpedoes and more than 20 shells in the first 2 minutes. She was transformed from a warship into a burning, sinking wreck before her guns could even be trained. The USS Chicago, sailing behind her, saw the tracers. Her captain, Howard Bode, was paralyzed by confusion. Was it a Japanese attack? Were the destroyers firing at a submarine? Before he could decide, a long-lance torpedo tore the bow off his ship. Mortally wounded, the Chicago turned away from the battle, and its captain, in a failure that would haunt the Navy, failed to send a clear warning to the northern force of what was coming. Mikawa's column, now illuminated by the burning Canberra, wheeled north around Savo Island, straight towards the other 3 American cruisers. The Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were sailing in a calm, box-like patrol pattern, their crews mostly asleep. They had seen the flashes to the south but had received no warning. Suddenly, Japanese searchlights, as bright as the sun, snapped on, pinning the Astoria in their glare. Japanese shells began to rain down. The Astoria's captain, awakened by the noise, rushed to the bridge, and seeing his gunners beginning to fire back, gave the most infamous order of the battle. "Cease firing! You're firing on our own ships!" An officer on the gun deck screamed back, "By God, sir, give us permission to shoot!" By the time the permission was given, the Astoria was a funeral pyre. The Quincy was next. She was caught in a brutal crossfire, illuminated by searchlights from both sides. She was hammered by shells and torpedoes, her captain killed on the bridge. She sank, her gun still firing defiantly as she went down. The Vincennes was last. She was methodically, almost clinically, torn apart by Japanese gunfire. Hit by at least 85 shells and multiple torpedoes, she rolled over and vanished. In 32 minutes, it was over. Gunichi Mikawa, with no radar, had achieved one of the most stunning victories in naval history. He had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers, killed 1,077 sailors, and had not suffered a single ship loss. He had sailed into the Dragon's Lair, faced the magic box, and proven it to be a fraud. Fearing air attack at dawn, he made the prudent decision to retreat, sparing the vulnerable American transports, but his tactical victory was absolute. It was the worst open sea defeat the U.S. Navy had ever suffered. In the aftermath, as the U.S. Navy reeled in shame and horror, the Japanese were confused. Their victory was glorious, but it was also a deep, troubling puzzle. The intelligence teams led by Dr. Ito debriefed the returning officers. They knew the Americans had radar. They had the captured sets to prove it. They had gone into that battle expecting to be detected, expecting to have to fight their way through a wall of accurate, radar-directed gunfire. And yet the enemy had been blind. They had sailed right into the middle of them. They had sunk 4 of their best ships. The Americans had acted as if they were completely, utterly deaf and blind. The Japanese reaction was not just arrogance, it was genuine bewilderment. Their analysis of the captured radar had suggested it was a clumsy defensive tool. The Battle of Savo Island, they concluded, proved their analysis was correct. The American technology was useless. Their men were poorly trained. The Japanese fighting spirit was, and would always be, superior. And here is the heart of the story. The Japanese admission that they never imagined seeing ships in the dark was not just about the technology itself. It was about their inability to imagine that such technology could be mastered and weaponized in the way they had mastered the human eye. They had captured the hardware, but they had completely missed the idea. They had missed the revolution. That revolution, for the U.S. Navy, was born in the fires of Savo Island. The defeat was so total, so humiliating, that it forced a complete and total reckoning. A scathing investigation, the Hepburn Report, tore apart the failures of the night. It identified the core problem. It wasn't the technology. It was the doctrine. The radar had worked. The humans had failed. The result was the birth of one of the most important concepts in modern warfare, the Combat Information Center, or CIC. No longer would a single, tired operator on an open bridge try to interpret a flickering screen. The Navy decreed that a new brain would be built into every ship. Deep in the hull, protected by armor, a new dedicated compartment would be created. In this dark, red-lit room, a team of officers and sailors would do one thing: fuse information. They would take the raw data from the SG surface radar, from the air search radar, from sonar, from radio intercepts, and from lookouts, and plot it all on a single, comprehensive map. They would filter the clutter from the contacts. They would provide the captain not with a confusing blip, but with a clear, unambiguous picture of the battle. They had finally built the system that the technology required. While the Americans were revolutionizing their doctrine, the Japanese were doubling down on their old one. They did begin to build their own radars, like the Type 21 and Type 22, based in part on what they had learned from the captured sets. But they were always a step behind. Their sets were crude, unreliable, and their officers didn't trust them. They were never integrated into their fire control systems. To the very end of the war, the Japanese lookout and his giant binoculars remained the primary sensor of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans, meanwhile, were just getting started. The new doctrine and the new technology were put to the test in the brutal, bloody night battles that followed around Guadalcanal. In the Battle of Cape Esperance, the USS Boise used its radar to help destroy the Japanese cruiser Furutaka. In the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the battleship USS Washington, in a pitch-black melee, used its radar to find and systematically execute the Japanese battleship Kirishima. The magic box was no longer a toy. It was a killer. The final brutal graduation ceremony for this new way of war came just over a year later, in November 1943, the Battle of Cape St. George. By now, the tide had turned. The Americans were on the offensive. A squadron of 5 U.S. destroyers, Destroyer Squadron 23, led by the legendary Captain Arleigh 31-knot Burke, was on patrol. They were the Little Beavers, and they were hunting the Tokyo Express. In the early morning darkness, the CIC on Burke's flagship, the USS Charles Osborne, was a model of calm efficiency. "Contact," the radar operator said, his voice flat. "Bogies, bearing 060, range 23,000 yards. On the plot, the team tracked the contacts. 5 Japanese destroyers. Burke had them. But he did not charge. He did not turn on his searchlights. He became a ghost. He used his radar plot to maneuver his ships with geometric precision, gaining a perfect textbook firing position on the enemy's flank. The Japanese, with their superior lookouts, sailed on, completely, blissfully unaware. They were blind. "Stand by for torpedo attack," Burke ordered. His ships turned as one. "Fire torpedoes." A spread of American fish, now far more reliable, hissed into the water. They ran silent, deep, and true. For several agonizing minutes, the Americans watched the green sweep of their radar screens. The Japanese sailors, scanning the horizon, saw nothing. And then the night was torn in half. The destroyer Onami erupted in a colossal fireball as multiple torpedoes struck her magazines. She was gone. The destroyer Makinami was hit, crippled, her back broken. Only then, after his torpedoes had struck home, did Arleigh Burke give the next order: commence firing. The American 5-inch guns, aimed entirely by their radar directors, roared to life. The shells, guided by an invisible hand, screamed through the blackness and found their targets. The Makinami was pounded into scrap. The other Japanese destroyers, in a state of total panic, turned and fled. Burke's squadron, like a pack of wolves guided by a single mind, hunted them down, methodically crippling the Yugiri. It was not a battle. It was an execution. It was the perfect night battle the Japanese had always dreamed of, fought against them by a machine. Burke's report was simple: clean sweep. The Japanese had captured the American radar in 1942. They had held the future in their hands. They had studied its wires and its tubes, but they had failed to see its soul. They saw a clumsy box, but they failed to imagine the system, the doctrine, and the revolution it represented. Their admission that they never imagined seeing ships in the dark was the epitaph for their entire philosophy. They had perfected the human eye, only to be rendered blind by the human mind. The long, dark night of the Imperial Japanese Navy had truly and finally begun.